In 1927, someone saw a Paradise Parrot alive for the last confirmed time. There was nothing prehistoric about the moment. No ancient forest, no lost continent, no creature surviving from another age. It was 20th century Australia. Cars already existed. Telephones existed. Cities were expanding. People were photographing wildlife, collecting specimens, keeping birds in aviaries, and beginning to understand that some species could disappear forever. And yet, somewhere in Queensland, one of the most spectacular parrots Australia had ever produced was approaching its final days. The bird was only about 10.5 inches long, roughly the length of a ruler. But its colors were extraordinary. Turquoise, emerald green, scarlet, black, brown, a long tail almost as long as its body. And it had one of the strangest nesting habits known among Australian parrots. Instead of building a conventional nest in a tree, it could disappear into a termite mound. The bird would excavate a tunnel through the hard mound and create a chamber inside it, where it laid its eggs almost at ground level. For thousands of generations, that strategy had worked. Then the landscape changed. Grasslands were burned differently. Grazing intensified. Native vegetation was altered. Termite mounds were disturbed. Drought struck. Introduced predators arrived. Collectors trapped birds for aviaries. No single event explains the disappearance. That is what makes this story so disturbing. Because the Paradise Parrot was not destroyed by one spectacular catastrophe. It was slowly squeezed out of existence. And when people finally realized how serious the situation had become, there may already have been too few birds left to save. This is the story of the Paradise Parrot, and the mystery is not simply why it disappeared. The deeper question is how a bird that had survived for generations in the Australian landscape could vanish in the space of a human lifetime. The first problem is that the Paradise Parrot never looked like a bird that should have been forgotten. Imagine walking across the open woodland of southeastern Queensland in the 19th century. The country is not dense rainforest. There are scattered eucalyptus trees, open grass beneath them, river valleys, low woodland, patches of scrub, termite mounds rising from the ground. And somewhere among the grass, a pair of small parrots moves almost unnoticed. Then the male lifts his head. Suddenly the landscape has color. His forehead and body catch the light with vivid green and turquoise. Red appears on the lower body and wings. Dark brown and black contrast with the brighter feathers. His tail stretches behind him, unusually long for a bird that spends so much time on the ground. The female is more subdued. That difference between the sexes is common in birds, but in the Paradise Parrot it was striking. The male was almost flamboyant. The female was quieter in appearance, with softer colors that made her less conspicuous. Together, they belong to a landscape that has changed enormously since their time. The species was associated mainly with grassy woodlands and open forests around the Queensland-New South Wales border, particularly southeastern Queensland. Historical accounts describe lightly timbered country with native grasses, scattered eucalyptus woodland, and termite mounds. This detail matters because the Paradise Parrot was not simply living in the Australian bush. It depended on a particular combination of conditions: open enough for grass seeds, wooded enough to provide shelter, suitable enough for termites to build their mounds, and stable enough for the birds to return to familiar nesting places. The species was once described as moderately common within its restricted range, but its range was never enormous. That creates a dangerous ecological situation. A species can appear common locally while still being vulnerable across its entire distribution. If almost every individual lives inside one broad environmental system, changing that system can affect the entire population at once. The Paradise Parrot also lived unusually close to the ground. It foraged largely on native grass seeds. That meant its survival was tied to what happened to the grass. Not simply whether grass existed, but whether native grasses produced the right seeds at the right time in sufficient quantities. That distinction would eventually become critical, because the same landscape that humans considered excellent grazing country was, from the perspective of the Paradise Parrot, a complex ecological machine. Cattle wanted grass. The parrot wanted grass seed. But those two requirements were not necessarily compatible. And there was another part of the machine that was even easier to overlook: the termite mound. To a person crossing the landscape, it might look like a pile of hardened earth. To a paradise parrot, it could be a home. The bird's strangest adaptation was hidden inside those mounds. And understanding that adaptation reveals why the species was more vulnerable than its brilliant colors suggested. A termite mound can look almost like a small fortress. Hard on the outside, compact, dry, built by thousands of insects. For the paradise parrot, it could become something completely different: a nursery. The birds were capable of excavating a tunnel into a terrestrial termite mound. The tunnel led inward to a nesting chamber. They are often close to ground level. The female could lay a clutch of roughly 3 to 5 eggs. The nest was not a decorative structure. There were no twigs arranged in a cup, no elaborate platform high above predators. Instead, the bird modified an existing structure built by another animal. That is a remarkable example of ecological opportunity. The termites created the architecture. The parrot became the tenant. And the relationship gave the bird something extremely valuable: protection inside a structure that was much harder to reach than an ordinary ground nest. But the same specialization that made the strategy effective also created a weakness. The bird needed suitable termite mounds, and those mounds existed within a particular type of grassland and woodland environment. The paradise parrot was therefore connected to several things at once: native grass seeds, open woodland, termite colonies, suitable nesting structures, and the seasonal conditions that allowed all of them to persist. Remove one piece, and the bird might survive. Remove several pieces over decades, and the entire system begins to fail. This is why extinction is often misunderstood. People imagine a final moment. A last bird falls silent. A forest is cut down. A hunter fires a shot. But biological extinction rarely works like a switch. It is usually a process. A population becomes smaller, then more fragmented, then harder to find, then harder to breed, then dependent on a few remaining places. Eventually, every observation becomes precious, and eventually, there are no observations at all. The paradise parrot's history followed that pattern. The species have been scientifically described in the 19th century. John Gould described it in 1845, using information associated with the field naturalist John Gilbert. Gould gave it the evocative common name beautiful parakeet. Later, the name paradise parrot became widely used. Its scientific identity also changed with taxonomic revisions. For much of its history, it was known as Psephotellus pulcherrimus. Modern taxonomic treatments place it in the genus Psephotellus. The Latin species name is fitting. Pulcherrimus refers to beauty. And if there was ever an Australian bird whose name seemed almost too obvious, this was it. But beauty would become part of the tragedy. During the 19th century, beautifully colored birds were highly desirable to collectors and aviculturists. A bird that was visually spectacular could be worth more alive than many ordinary species. That created pressure from a completely different direction. The paradise parrot was not merely losing habitat. Some individuals were being removed from it. Trapping for aviaries has been identified as one of the factors that contributed to the species' decline. Egg collecting has also been suggested in historical accounts, but it would be wrong to turn this into a simple story about collectors killing the bird. The evidence points towards something much more complicated. The species had several pressures acting at the same time, and those pressures interacted. Imagine a population already living in a restricted range. Now reduce the amount of suitable grassland. Then alter the way that grassland is burned. Then increase grazing pressure. Then experience a severe drought. Then disturb some of the termite mounds that the birds use for nesting. Then add introduced predators, such as feral cats. Then remove some birds for captivity. Each factor alone might not have been enough. Together, they could push the population beyond recovery. That is the central lesson of the Paradise Parrot. Its extinction was not necessarily caused by the most dramatic threat. It was caused by the accumulation of threats. And one of those threats began with something that looked harmless: grass. The 19th century pastoral expansion of Australia transformed enormous areas of native vegetation. From a human perspective, open grassland could look productive. From the perspective of a grazing animal, more grass could mean more food. But native ecosystems are not simply collections of individual plants. They're systems governed by timing: fire, zen, grazing, seed production, shelter, invertebrates, soils, and the animals that depend on all of them. The Paradise Parrot fed primarily on grass seeds. That meant the bird was not simply looking for green vegetation. It needed mature seed. And historical sources suggest that annual burning of native grasses at critical times could reduce seed availability. Overgrazing could do the same. The problem becomes obvious when you follow the chain. Too much grazing, fewer seed-producing grasses, less food, lower breeding success, fewer young birds, then drought, even less seed. The population shrinks. And when a species is already restricted to one region, shrinking food supplies can become catastrophic. The severe drought of 1902 is repeatedly identified in modern reviews as one of the environmental stresses that may have contributed to the decline. But drought alone does not explain the extinction. Australia had droughts before. The Paradise Parrot had survived dry periods in the past. What changed was the landscape around the drought. A natural drought acting on a resilient ecosystem is one thing. A severe drought acting on a landscape already modified by grazing, altered fire regimes, clearing, and other pressures is something else. The bird did not need a perfect world. It needed a functioning one, and the margin was disappearing. There was another problem. The Paradise Parrot's nest was hidden in a termite mound. That sounds like an advantage, and it was. But termite mounds are not independent objects scattered randomly across the landscape. They are products of a living ecosystem. If the vegetation changes, the soil changes. If grazing changes the vegetation, the conditions for termites may change. If land is cleared, mounds can be damaged or destroyed. If fire regimes change, the entire structure of the grassland community can shift. So the bird's nesting strategy tied it to the landscape even more tightly. It was not enough to protect the birds. You needed the world that produced their nesting sites. That is a lesson modern conservation has learned repeatedly. Saving an animal is sometimes impossible if the habitat that supports its behavior has disappeared. The Paradise Parrot was a specialist hiding inside what looked like a generalist landscape. And by the early 20th century, that landscape was becoming increasingly hostile. Yet there was still a chance. At least, some people believe there was. And that is where the story becomes personal. Because the final years of the Paradise Parrot were not completely ignored. There were people who saw what was happening. One of them was Cyril Gerard. Gerard lived in the Gayndah district of Queensland and became closely associated with the last known Paradise Parrots. His photographs and observations are among the most important surviving records of the species' final years. One image from 1922 is especially haunting. Gerard stands beside an abandoned paradise parrot nest excavated into a termite mound. The photograph is not dramatic in the conventional sense. There is no dead animal, no storm, no fire, just a man beside a mound. But the photograph captures something that words often fail to communicate. The bird had built a home here, and now the home was empty. The surrounding country was open and grassy, exactly the kind of habitat the species had used. But the same landscape was also valuable to cattle grazers. That created a conflict that conservationists of the period were not yet equipped to solve. A beautiful bird could attract sympathy. An ordinary grassland was much harder to protect. People could understand why a rare animal should be saved. It was much harder to persuade society that the landscape itself had to remain in a particular condition for that animal to survive. And the paradise parrot needed both, bird and habitat. Neither was enough alone. Gerard and the naturalist Alec Chisholm understood that the situation was becoming desperate. In early 1922, after an active nest was found, they considered taking young birds into captivity with the hope of breeding them under controlled conditions. It was an ambitious idea. Today, captive breeding is one of the standard tools of conservation. At the time, the science was far less developed. There were no modern population management databases, no genetic management programs, no sophisticated reproductive technologies, and very little understanding of the exact environmental requirements of the paradise parrot. The plan failed. The breeding attempt that year did not succeed, and the opportunity disappeared. No active paradise parrot nest was subsequently made known to ornithologists. The irony is brutal. People were discussing captive breeding while the last wild birds were already becoming almost impossible to find. The species had reached the point where saving it required finding enough birds to begin with. And that was becoming the problem. By the time the warning became urgent, the population was already extremely small. In 1926, conservationist and ornithologist Alec Chisholm was still warning about declining Australian parrots and advocating captive breeding and release. But the paradise parrot was already near the edge. Then came 1927. A live paradise parrot was confirmed. And after that, silence. There were later reports. Some sightings were claimed. Some were investigated. But modern reviews regard post-1920s records as unreliable. The last confirmed record remains 1927. That distinction matters. Extinction is not usually witnessed. Nobody stands beside a species and announces, "This is the final individual." There is simply a last reliable record. Then another year passes. Then another. Researchers search. People report possible sightings. Photographs are examined. Specimens are compared. And eventually the evidence becomes overwhelming. The paradise parrot was gone. But there was one extraordinary question. Could it still be hiding somewhere? This is where the story of the paradise parrot becomes almost a detective story. When a species disappears, scientists do not immediately know that it is extinct. They search. They listen. They examine habitat. They question observers. They look for feathers, nests, eggs, tracks, photographs, or any other evidence that can establish survival. For a small, colorful parrot living in open country, hope remained for years. The bird had once been difficult to find in some areas. It could move quickly. It could live in pairs. Its historical range, while restricted, covered a substantial area. A few unconfirmed reports, therefore, had to be taken seriously enough to investigate. But there is an enormous difference between seeing something that resembles a lost species and producing evidence that survives scientific scrutiny. A green parrot in Australia is not automatically a paradise parrot. A distant flash of red is not proof. A memory of a bird seen decades earlier is not the same as a specimen, and a rumor cannot replace a population. The more time passed, the more difficult the search became. If even a tiny population had survived, it would need food. It would need breeding sites. It would need suitable termite mounds or other nesting structures. It would need enough individuals to reproduce. And it would need to survive in a landscape that had already contributed to the species' collapse. That last point is crucial. Even if one or two birds had somehow survived beyond 1927, that would not necessarily mean the species had recovered. A species is not saved by the survival of one individual. It needs a viable population. This is why modern conservation biologists distinguish between a sighting and evidence of persistence. The Paradise Parrot gives us a perfect example. The possibility of survival remained emotionally powerful, but the evidence never caught up with the hope. The final confirmed bird remained in 1927, and today the species is classified as extinct. There is no captive population waiting somewhere, no hidden breeding colony, no modern reintroduction project using living paradise parrots. The species exists only in specimens, illustrations, photographs, written observations, and scientific records. That makes every surviving image unusually valuable, and there are not many. The Australian Museum holds specimens of the bird, including one presented from the estate of Sir Edward Hallstrom. Museum collections are often described as places where dead things are stored, but for extinct species, they become something more important. They are evidence. A specimen can preserve structure, plumage, bones, DNA, measurements, information that cannot be recovered from memory. And in the case of the Paradise Parrot, preserved material has allowed scientists to ask a question that earlier generations could not answer. Was the species already genetically weakened before it disappeared? At first glance, the answer might seem obvious. If a population becomes tiny, inbreeding can reduce genetic diversity. Small populations can lose genetic variation. That can increase vulnerability to disease, environmental change, and reproductive problems. Perhaps the Paradise Parrot had simply reached the end of a long genetic decline. But science did not find such a simple answer. In 2019, researchers examined a 19th century Paradise Parrot genome and reported no signs of genetic erosion in that sample. That does not mean genetics played no role. It means the evidence does not support the idea that severe genetic erosion was the main explanation visible in that historical genome. And this creates another reversal. The bird may not have been genetically doomed. It may have been ecologically overwhelmed. That is a very different story. A healthy population can disappear if the environment supporting it changes too quickly or too extensively. A species does not have to become biologically defective before extinction. Sometimes the world around it changes first. And that brings us back to the termite mound. The Paradise Parrot's nesting behavior was extraordinary, but it was not unique among all Australian parrots. Two living relatives, the golden-shouldered parrot and the hooded parrot, also excavate nesting chambers in termite mounds. That relationship gives scientists an opportunity to understand what may have happened. The golden-shouldered parrot, in particular, demonstrates how closely a termite nesting parrot can be tied to fire, grassland structure, and land management. The Paradise Parrot had occupied a similar ecological niche, but it disappeared. Its close relatives survived. Why? Because extinction is rarely determined by one trait. Two species can share a behavior and still experience very different outcomes depending on geography, population size, habitat availability, and the specific pressures acting on them. The Paradise Parrot's range was restricted. Its preferred habitat was being modified. Its food base was being altered. Its nesting sites could be disturbed. Predators had been introduced, birds were trapped, and drought added another layer of stress. The species did not need one enemy. It had many. That is the hidden danger of cumulative pressure. Imagine a person trying to carry a heavy box. One extra kilogram may not matter. Then another. Then another. At some point, the problem is no longer any single weight. The problem is the total load. The Paradise parrot's extinction appears to have worked in much the same way. Land clearing removed habitat. Pastoralism changed the grassland. Overgrazing reduced food availability. Fire regimes changed. Drought intensified the pressure. Predators added mortality. Trapping removed birds. The destruction or disturbance of termite mounds potentially reduced nesting opportunities. No single factor needs to be declared the murderer. The landscape itself had become a trap. And there is something else about the Paradise parrot that makes its story particularly painful. It was not an animal that demanded much. It was not a giant predator. It did not require a vast territory of untouched forest. It did not need a rare food found in one isolated cave. It was a small seed-eating bird. Its habitat looked ordinary. Its requirements looked modest. And yet that modesty may have made the decline harder to recognize. A spectacular tiger disappearing from a forest is obvious. A whale disappearing from an ocean is enormous. A small parrot disappearing from grassland can happen quietly. The grass is still there. The trees are still there. The termite mounds may still stand. People can walk through the landscape and see nothing obviously missing. But an ecosystem can look familiar while losing the species that once made it complete. That is one of the most dangerous illusions in conservation. A landscape can remain green and still be biologically poorer. The Paradise parrot may have been one of the first clear examples of that process on mainland Australia after European colonization. Today, its disappearance is remembered as a warning, not because it was the largest extinction, not because it was the most famous, but because it demonstrates how quickly a species can disappear when several ordinary pressures converge. And there is a human story inside that warning. The people who watched the Paradise parrot vanish were not living in a world that understood modern conservation. They did not have the tools we possess now, but some of them understood the danger. They photographed the birds. They documented their nests. They tried to raise concern. They discussed captive breeding. They warned other ornithologists. Yet knowledge alone was not enough. Knowing that a species is declining does not automatically give society the ability to reverse the decline. This may be one of the hardest lessons from the Paradise parrot. Sometimes the problem is not that nobody noticed. Sometimes people noticed too late. By the 1920s, the bird had become so rare that finding enough individuals for a conservation breeding program was itself a major challenge. The species had crossed a threshold. The population was no longer simply small. It was disappearing from the landscape. And once a species reaches that stage, every year matters. Every breeding season matters. Every nest matters. Every surviving pair matters. The 1922 photograph of Jared beside the abandoned termite mound, therefore, takes on a different meaning. At the time, it might have seemed like documentation. Today, it looks like a memorial. A human being stands beside the architecture of a bird that was already slipping away. The mound remains. The bird does not. That contrast is almost impossible to ignore. The structure survived. The species did not. And the same landscape that once seemed ordinary became historical evidence. There is another reason the Paradise parrot remains scientifically important. Modern researchers can now study extinct species in ways that were impossible in the 1920s. Museum specimens can be sampled. Historical DNA can be sequenced. Old observations can be compared with modern ecological knowledge. Distribution records can be reconstructed. Fire history and vegetation change can be investigated. Taxonomy can be revised. And conservation scientists can compare the extinct paradise parrot with surviving relatives. The result is not a single neat answer. It is a reconstruction, a population under pressure, a specialized nesting strategy, a restricted distribution, changing land use, altered fire regimes, grazing, drought, predation, trapping, and eventually no confirmed birds. This is why responsible science uses words such as likely, probably, and contributed, because extinction rarely leaves behind a signed confession. There is no final paradise parrot saying what killed its species. There is only evidence, and the evidence points toward a combination of pressures. That uncertainty should not weaken the story. It should make it more honest, because if we pretend there was one villain, we learn the wrong lesson. If we say, the paradise parrot disappeared because of cats, we may miss the habitat problem. If we say, it disappeared because of grazing, we may miss fire and drought. If we say, collectors killed it, we ignore the landscape transformation that was happening at the same time. The truth is more uncomfortable. A species can be lost because an entire system becomes slightly less suitable year after year. No single action has to be fatal. The accumulation can be. And the paradise parrot was exceptionally vulnerable to that accumulation. Its diet connected it to native grasses. Its nesting behavior connected it to termite mounds. Its restricted range connected it to one region. Its social and reproductive behavior meant it needed surviving pairs. And its beauty connected it to the human desire to collect rare birds. Everything about it was connected. That is what makes the extinction so difficult to reduce to a single cause. The bird itself was an ecological network in miniature. Take away the grass seeds. The bird struggles. Take away the nesting mounds. The bird struggles. Change the fire regime. The grass changes. Increase grazing. The seed supply changes. Introduce predators. Survival falls. Trap the remaining adults. The breeding population shrinks. Then add drought. And suddenly the system has no margin left. The paradise parrot did not need humanity to deliberately decide to eliminate it. It only needed humanity to change enough of the world around it. That distinction matters, because most modern extinctions do not begin with a decision to destroy a species. They begin with decisions that appear unrelated. A pasture is expanded. A grassland is burned at a different time. A woodland is cleared. A predator is introduced. A rare animal is collected. A nesting structure is removed. Each action has a purpose from the human point of view, but the animal experiences the combined result. The paradise parrot experienced that combined result until there were no more confirmed birds. And perhaps the most haunting part is how recently this happened. Not thousands of years ago, not during the age of dinosaurs, not before written history. The world was already modern. The first commercial radio broadcasts were spreading. Air travel was developing. Motion pictures were becoming a mass medium. And in the Australian landscape, a species was disappearing forever. A person alive today could have spoken to someone who saw the last paradise parrots. That is the scale of the loss. One generation. That is all it took for a bird once seen in the Australian landscape to become a museum specimen. And that should change how we think about extinction. Extinction is often presented as something distant, something that happens to ancient animals, something associated with fossils. But the paradise parrot is a reminder that extinction can happen within a human lifetime. A child could have seen the bird. That child could have grown old. And by the end of that person's life, the bird could have disappeared completely. There is no evolutionary timescale required, only pressure and time. The Paradise Parrot also destroys another comforting assumption. We often imagine that beautiful animals are more likely to be protected. Sometimes they are. Beauty attracts attention. Beauty creates sympathy. Beauty fills museums and books. But beauty can also create demand. In the 19th century, rare birds were prized by collectors. The Paradise Parrot's spectacular plumage was part of its appeal. The same trait that made people admire it could make individuals valuable. That is a paradox written directly into its history. The bird was admired. The bird was collected. The bird became rare. And as it became rarer, the remaining individuals could become even more precious to collectors. This is one reason conservation eventually moved toward a different philosophy. Wild animals are not collectibles. A specimen in a cabinet is not equivalent to a living population. A museum can preserve evidence of a species. It cannot restore the ecological relationships that existed when the species was alive. You can preserve feathers. You cannot preserve a flock. You can preserve a skeleton. You cannot preserve the behavior of a pair excavating a termite mound. You can preserve DNA. But DNA alone does not recreate an ecosystem. And this is where the Paradise Parrot becomes more than a story about a vanished bird. It becomes a story about what extinction actually removes. We lost a species, but we also lost behaviors. We lost a particular relationship with termite mounds. We lost a specific pattern of feeding on native grass seeds. We lost the sound of the bird in its habitat. We lost its seasonal movements and pair interactions. We lost observations that were never recorded. We lost behaviors that nobody knew were important. And we lost the possibility of discovering something about the bird that it would have taught us if it had survived. Every extinction is also an extinction of knowledge. The 2019 genomic study provides a remarkable example. More than a century after the bird began to disappear, scientists could still extract information from its preserved remains. A 19th century specimen became a source of genetic evidence. The dead bird was telling us something about its past. But even the most advanced technology has limits. DNA can tell us about genetic diversity. It cannot bring the bird back into the grassland. A sequence can be analyzed. A population cannot be reconstructed from nothing. That is the final boundary of extinction. Once every living individual is gone, conservation changes from rescue to remembrance. And remembrance matters, because the Paradise Parrot is not just a name on a list. It was a living animal with a specific shape, color, habitat, behavior, and place in the Australian ecosystem. The male had turquoise and green plumage, red patches, a dark crown, a long tail. The female was more subdued. Pairs moved through open country. They searched the ground for seeds. They approached termite mounds. They excavated tunnels. They raised young inside chambers hidden in hardened earth. For generations, that life worked. Then it stopped. The final confirmed sighting in 1927 did not announce itself as the end. There was no ceremony, no final photograph that everyone recognized as the last. No national alarm. The world simply continued. People went to work. Cattle grazed. Grass grew. Termites built their mounds. Seasons changed. And somewhere in the uncertainty, the last Paradise Parrot disappeared. That is what makes the final sighting so powerful. The bird did not know it was the last. It was simply living, searching for food, flying, perching, perhaps returning to a familiar part of the landscape, perhaps looking for another bird, perhaps searching for a nesting site. There is something profoundly human about imagining that final moment. Not because we know what happened. We do not. But because the absence of a final moment is itself the point. Extinction does not require a dramatic ending. Sometimes the last chapter is simply a silence that nobody recognizes until years later. and yet the story did not completely disappear. The bird survived in photographs, in illustrations, in specimens, in museum drawers, in scientific papers, in the photographs of Cyril Jared, in the records of John Gould, in the work of Alec Chisholm, in the genetic material preserved from 19th century birds, and in the landscapes where termite mounds still rise from the ground. Those things are fragments, but together they allow us to reconstruct a world that no longer exists. A world where one of Australia's most beautiful parrots walked through grassland. A world where a termite mound could be a home. A world where the bird was common enough to be seen, but not common enough to survive the transformation that followed. The Paradise Parrot story, therefore, ends with a strange contradiction. Its disappearance is final, but the warning is still alive. The bird is gone. The conditions that threatened it are not ancient. Habitat alteration is still a conservation problem. Grazing pressure can still reshape ecosystems. Fire regimes can still determine which plants survive. Introduced predators still affect Australian wildlife, and species can still become trapped between a changing landscape and a shrinking population. Modern conservation has tools that Chisholm and Jared could barely have imagined. Genomics, remote cameras, satellite mapping, population models, habitat restoration, predator control, captive breeding, translocation, fire management, precise monitoring. The tragedy of the Paradise Parrot is that these tools arrived too late for this species. But they do not have to arrive too late for others. That may be the most important legacy of an extinct animal. It cannot be saved, but it can teach. It can show us what a disappearing population looks like before the final record. It can show us how habitat loss interacts with food availability. It can show us why specialized nesting behavior matters. It can show us why a species that appears small and ordinary can be ecologically irreplaceable. And it can show us the difference between noticing a problem and having enough time to solve it. The Paradise Parrot had survived Australia's changing climate for generations. It had survived predators that evolved alongside it. It had evolved a relationship with termites. It had evolved to exploit native grasslands. It had survived droughts and seasonal fires. But the modern landscape did not change one variable. It changed many. That is the central paradox. The bird was not necessarily too weak to survive. The world around it became too different, and that is why the Paradise Parrot deserves to be remembered. Not as a mysterious creature from the distant past, not as a colorful footnote in a bird book, but as a species that was alive within the memory of modern people. A bird that disappeared after European colonization. A bird that was still being observed in the 1920s. A bird for which people were already discussing conservation. And a bird that still vanished. The last confirmed sighting was in 1927. Nearly a century has passed. No confirmed population returned. No hidden colony was found. No captive breeding program preserved the species. The termite mounds remain. The grasslands have changed. The photographs remain. And the bird is gone. So return to the beginning. A person sees a small parrot in Queensland. The bird is alive. It has no idea that history is about to close around it. It does not know that its species will soon become extinct. It does not know that future scientists will argue over the exact causes of its disappearance. It does not know that people will one day study its DNA to determine whether genetic erosion played a role. It simply exists, and perhaps that is the most important thing to remember. Every endangered species is still living in the present, not in a museum, not in a history book, not as a symbol, as an animal, a population that still has a chance. The Paradise Parrot had that chance once. We did not understand how quickly it could disappear. Today, we know more. The question is whether we will act while there are still living animals left to save. If you could travel back to one moment in the final decades of the Paradise Parrot, which moment would you choose? The first signs of its decline, the discovery of the abandoned termite mound nest, or the final confirmed sighting in 1927? And if the evidence had been understood earlier, do you think this extraordinary bird could have been saved? The Paradise Parrot is gone, but the lesson it left behind is still alive. Extinction does not always arrive with a roar. Sometimes it arrives as fewer birds, fewer nests, less grass seed, one empty termite mound, one missing pair, 1 year without a sighting, and then another, until one day there is only silence.